Chris, we're fresh off the heels of Southeast Ruby.
I know, it was super fun. I enjoyed it.
Are you recovered?
Yeah. It just took a night or two of sleeping in, but I'm all good. How about you?
I am still not recovered. I got home and my arm is injured, so I was like,
Oh,
"Oh, I'm going to rest," and then now I'm not sleeping. So living the dream.
fun.
So today is a special day for us. We have David Heinemeier Hansson joining us. David, do you mind just maybe giving a brief introduction, even though you may not need one?
Sure, of course. Um, so I wrote Ruby on Rails back in 2003 and released it in 2004. And I've been working with Ruby since about a year in advance of that or so. Rails was really my first big Ruby project. Um, well, that's not entirely true. My first real big Ruby project was Basecamp, but Basecamp was Rails when it got started. Those two things were intertwined. Rails was extracted from Basecamp. Once I felt I had something that could be packaged up and shared with the world. And then before that, I was not really a programmer in the sense of thinking of myself, this is a career that I want to pursue, and this is just something I want to do for all time. I'd been working in a number of programming languages and environments, both PHP and Java, that had some influences on me, but I didn't have the programmer identity yet. That really did not kick in until I discovered Ruby, and I found that this was something I truly loved doing. And before that, I had some false steps and starts at trying to learn how to program all the way from 6 years old on my Amstrad computer, trying to type in some game from the back of a magazine that never worked after you'd spend 40 minutes typing it in, which was a real drag. And then another time at I think 12 or 13 years old, trying to learn this thing called Easy Amos, which was also about games. All my programming, all my computer interest was really about games from a young age. I just loved video games, loved computer games. And I thought that my involvement with programming would be through games. Not necessarily that I would be programming, but I remember reading this British magazine called Edge, which was a magazine about the video game industry. And I love this idea of video game development as an endeavor of a team coming together, working on something for 2, 3, 4, in some cases, I guess 10 years to create a game. And I thought I wanted to be part of that, but I didn't quite know what my role was going to be. I thought maybe sort of game designer or producer or something of that sorts. So I was kind of a reluctant programmer. I had a lot of programming friends, and they did a lot of programming that I understood absolutely nothing of. Assembler, in particular, was never something that was compatible with my brain, and neither was C and pointer arithmetics or any of that really low-level stuff, which games is really a lot about. That most actual game programming is not exactly akin to the kind of programming that I ended up liking. So I could see why it didn't take. But I'm really happy that route, getting into computers at a relatively young age, playing with computers a lot, failing at learning how to program, being interested in computers for the sake of using them to make stuff, make entertainment, make games. I was involved in the scene, too, as it was called, the demo scene in the Amiga days back in Europe. Again, not as a programmer, as sort of someone on the periphery, as a trader. I ran a bulletin board system. I had 3 modems in my tiny little room in our house in Copenhagen at 14 years old or something like that, and kind of always just wanted to be part of it, but didn't know where my role was going to be. So that's a really long-winded tale of how I then ended up finding my identity as a programmer, which was straight through finding my love of programming in the Ruby programming language.
That's funny because I had kind of a similar experience where my dad gave me an Atari programming book and we didn't have his Atari anymore, but I was like, wanting to make games too. And then reading that book, it was like, here's how to build a calculator. And I was always like, yeah, but how do I do like graphics and, all these other things? Um, at the beginning, you're like, I want to build something practical that, people can use. And it's kind of, games are just a lot of detail and you have to worry about physics and all this other stuff. And especially for performance, having to dive into assembly and stuff like that. So it's interesting to see that because I imagine there's quite a few people who have come from games as their inspiration to originally learn programming. So where did you go from there? You were kind of, how old were you when you were doing this stuff? And then like, how did you get into doing Ruby from there?
So these failed attempts were kind of, first at 6 years old. Well, not a big surprise there that didn't take. Then again at 12 or 13, that didn't take. Then kind of getting involved into programming through sort of the side door. I was setting up that bulletin board system when I was like 14, 15. And that didn't really involve programming, but it did have some scripting. I forget what the bulletin board system was called, but you could kind of configure it as to how it should look and what the flow was going to be. So it was really an information system. And I think that was part of the shift that I got interested in the information systems. It came through games, and I thought I wanted to make games. And then I learned what making games was actually about, which is a whole lot of math and pointer arithmetics and all this other stuff we just talked about. Realized I didn't actually like any of that. And then being on the periphery of games, first through running a bulletin board system that was all about distributing pirated games. It was all wares stuff. I then got involved in the internet. So the internet came to me in maybe 94, I think. 94, 93, I was senior year of just whatever elementary school, or it's called something, ninth grade, whatever that was. And we went to university on some excursion, and the class got sat down in front of a bunch of computers that had whatever the early browser was, Netscape something, and got shown what HTML was and what you could do. And that was really a powerful moment for me because here was something on the screen and you would change some tags, like you would insert blink and then the text would blink. And it was such an immediate feedback loop. It was nothing like these other programming excursions I had tried before, where there was just so much setup work. Before you could get anything even on the screen, you had to know and do so much. Versus HTML, I mean, not really a programming language, it's a markup language, but it kind of felt a little bit like a programming language to me at that time. And it felt incredibly powerful to be able to make the computer show stuff just by changing a few tags. So that experience stuck, and I learned a little bit more about HTML, and I started working on gaming websites. And I did a bunch of the HTML for the gaming websites and the original sort of setup for that. And then I worked with some friends of mine who were programmers to do sort of the back end for it. This was early days CMS systems, basically, which was, again, like 95 or something like that. And I just, I worked with programmers. I would do some HTML. I would kind of just tell the programmer I was working with, the friend of mine I was working with, how I wanted the system to work. And I just really liked that. I really liked just designing the information systems. And that was how it eventually just became that I was a little less connected to the gaming world, or I kind of grew tired of that in some extent. And then what I was left with was this appreciation of information systems. And that was something that I really just found fascinating. And again, it's fun. Like, how do you get interested in the things you get interested in? If you just say it like, oh yeah, I love information systems, like that sounds so weird. It's easy to understand that a kid likes video games, perhaps a little harder to understand that a kid would like information systems. But so it was, and I kept pushing that, and I pushed it in all sorts of different directions. I did a bunch of front end work. I worked at a programming shop for a while doing front end quote unquote programming, which was basically some JavaScript and some JSP, the Java server side pages, which is basically a template language for this community software shop in Copenhagen. And then I kind of just got more and more into doing some PHP for myself and got proficient enough that I guess it counted as being a programmer. Even again, as I said, I didn't see myself as that. And I used that finally to get my first real programming job, which was for Jason Fried, who is my business partner at Basecamp now, and someone I've been working with together for 18, 19 years. So in that sense, my story is kind of short in the sense that there's this short preface, and then there's Basecamp and Rails. And that's basically what I've spent my entire professional career doing. Yeah.
That's awesome. When you're doing PHP, what year is it, or years?
This is let's see, 97 was probably when I did the first stuff myself. So 97 to 2002.
Okay.
I did some PHP. I was basically learning PHP over that time. I would do small tweaks to other people's stuff, and then I would start writing more and more of the stuff myself. And then by the year 2000, I worked on another Danish gaming site called Daily Rush, which is actually still around today. And it only just stopped running the original code that I wrote in 2000 about 2 years ago or something like that. So it had a pretty good 16 or 17 year run on some PHP code that I and a friend wrote back in 2000. But that was the first sort of big system where I wrote a material part of it. And then I used PHP for some other side projects in the following years. And then the first big project with Ruby was Basecamp and Rails.
Wow. So in 2000, I was 10 or 11 years old, and I didn't get into programming till I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. So I have to ask a question about when you're doing PHP, and I guess even other languages, is the concept of a framework, for the web, even a thing yet?
No, not in the PHP world, at least. Where it was a concept and where I was deeply fascinated it was in the Java world. There was, right from the get-go, when I got involved with Java in, let's say, 2001, Struts, which was sort of the original web framework, was out in the Java world. And the Java world just had a bunch of awesome ideas about frameworks. And again, this is based on partly my ignorance. I'm sure there were other frameworks before that, and there was Smalltalk, and there was all these other things. But my first exposure to the world of framework and package software in that regard was through Java. And PHP at the time certainly did not have any of that stuff. Or if there was something, it was not widespread, and it wasn't something that I was using. I was building sort of kind of my own little frameworky kind of things. And then it was when I started working at this Java shop and I got exposed to the Java world and saw all the different frameworks they had for talking to databases or frameworks for the web with struts and so on. I really got interested and thought, these are some wonderful ideas. What a shame they're trapped in Java. And that became really part of the motivation for Rails, was I wanted to marry those two worlds. I wanted to marry the awesome intellectual castles of Java with the immediacy and the sense of getting something on the screen right away that you would get from PHP. And I found Ruby to be a great way to express that communion that there was both things were possible at the same time. There was a language that really supported building sophisticated frameworks and had a focus on programmer productivity and happiness and immediacy and productivity that I didn't find when I was working with Java. So it really was just I came from those two influences, and they met in Ruby, and the result was Rails.
And Ruby was still very small back then, right? Because this was, I don't know, early 2000s. And I remember like at one point I was looking into learning a different language, like a scripting language, and I was choosing between Python and Ruby. And I went with Python because like Ubuntu Linux came with it already. And everybody was like, oh, they're pretty similar, like syntax wise, but that's mostly visual. And so I'm curious, how you ended up stumbling on Ruby out of, all these other languages. Were you already fiddling with a bunch of different languages, just kind of exploring them, or, what were you up to then?
Sort of. I mean, what's funny is I had a friend at the place I was working at, that Java shop, who was really big into Python. So he was really pitching me on Python. And I had looked at Python a little bit. And again, it's one of those things. How do we end up liking the things we like? When I looked at Python, I didn't see something where I just went like, oh man, I want to do that. Which is funny, because Python and Ruby in many ways share a lot of intellectual overlap. But it's also very different in other ways. And I just didn't find that appeal immediately with Python. And partly it is, I think, because I have a strong affinity to a visual aesthetic and line noise and how things actually look in an editor, where Ruby to me was just the most pure. And I don't mean pure in the small talk sense that like there's no keywords and the whole system can be described in one modern single principle, because Ruby is sort of the opposite of that in many ways. That it was so pure and simple in just what it could be boiled down to. It was incredibly expressive in a sense that you could make the system do an awfully lot in an awfully little amount of work. And the work afterwards felt like all the characters had meaning. They weren't there to please a compiler. They were there because they were telling you, the programmer, something. And it had been boiled free of all the extraneous stuff. And you know what? It's so silly. But one of the things I just have this searing memory of looking at some Python code and having such a strong dislike for underscore len underscore. I think that's what it is. Like forgetting the length of an array or something. And I just went like, Jesus, that's nasty. Like that's just a nasty ward on the system. And like if that's a thing I have to do all the time, like that's a major thing. Again, it's silly in the sense that it's not a rational, oh, well, can this thing solve the problems that I have? Of course it can. Of course it could build the same systems. And clearly many people did. And many people took the same ideas that I had or similar ideas that I had for Rails and did them in Python, Django, and otherwise. It's all great. It wasn't for me. I didn't have that connection. And that was what was so magic and still somewhat unexplainable. Like I can come up with all these like, oh, it's because of the blocks, or it's because of the ease of making DSLs, or it's because you can so invisibly extend the core language or the standard library with your own extensions. Yeah, I mean, there's probably some of all of that. But if I was to sum it down, I think actually love is a good expression for it, which I get has gotten a bit of a bad rep lately. And I think that's fair. I mean, not all programmers have to love their programming language, and not all programmers even love to program. For some people, it's just a job and they do it well and totally fine. I have the utmost respect for that. That just wasn't my trajectory. My trajectory was literally falling in love with Ruby and letting that change my personal trajectory, my professional trajectory, that I literally started thinking of myself as a programmer, something I could do for the rest of my life because of this programming language. That's a pretty big mark on someone's life. So, of course, I'm going to be biased. And then that bias is then doubled down by the fact that sort of pretty much the first thing I make, Ruby on Rails and Basecamp, turn out to be these 20-year successes.
I empathize a lot with just the idea of like loving Ruby, because when I had a brief stint trying to be a computer science major in college, and I was really like finding, I guess, kind of my identity as a programmer during then. And a lot of my classes were Java. And so I remember like learning these like data structures, just simple data structures like linked lists and things like that. And I remember like that was also the time I was kind of itching and inching my way into Ruby. And I remember like looking up like linked list Ruby, and there's like nothing about it. And I was like, that's what I want. So
yeah, that's a good way of describing it too. That part of the appeal of Ruby is all the things that make you not think about, which is kind of the joke of one of the first presentations I did on Rails. I was pointing to the screen and saying, look at all the things I'm not doing. And that was really the appeal I had with Ruby. Look at all the things we don't have to worry about. Look at all the things that are just given to us. And I have this still now. I mean, I write a fair amount of JavaScript, for example. And JavaScript these days is pretty good. I'm actually, I used to be not a big fan. And then there was such a big step forward for the language itself that it kind of feels and smells like Ruby some of the time. And then I'm still just constantly let down by the fact that it doesn't have all the built-in machinery, and you can't make it as nice and succinct as Ruby is. So sometimes it's like I'm looking for something and I just want to use one of the enumerable methods, and I'm like, oh geez, now I have to pull in some library, and like I gotta add a dependency, and I gotta crap. I'll just write it out, right? And then whenever I write it out, I just go like, ugh, and then I get that pull to abstract it, because I cannot look at a piece of code and see abstractions that are waiting to be taken out and then not do them. Like, that is incredibly hard for me to do. And I think that deficiency is, of course, what led to the creation of Ruby on Rails, that I kept looking for patterns of things that could be abstracted such that I could boil down the piece of code I was writing to its even barer fundamentals. Nothing sort of auxiliary, no computer concerns, just logical domain concerns. And Ruby, again, I mean, I've been writing my own Ruby for, again, damn near 20 years through active support, where whenever there's something in Ruby that isn't quite to my liking, which is actually incredibly rare in the grand scheme of things, Ruby is exactly perfect for me like 98% of the time. But where it really takes it to the sublime is the last 2% I get to add and I get to change. And the magic that Ruby endows me with the power, not only to do that, but to present those changes and my amendments to the language as though they were on even terms. That truly is just such a liberating concept, where you cannot tell the difference between a method that I've added to integer and one that came with the language. And I understand that for some people, that's actually a drawback, right? They scream monkey patching, and they're very afraid of what will happen if you allow programmers to change their environment. Where I go, this is exactly why I like Ruby. This is exactly why I like the environment. And if I could not do these things, who knows where things would have ended up. I feel it just utterly oppressive to work in a programming environment where I feel like there's some ivory tower language designers who knew better, and they're here to protect me from myself. Like, I always just get that rebellious instinct, like, fuck you. Like, maybe you know better, maybe you don't. I venture to say that the designers of Java back in early 90s, they probably didn't know everything just yet. And the straitjackets that they put over that language, at least at that time, didn't pan out so well. And all the rope that Mats gave us to hang ourselves with in Ruby, we didn't use it to hang ourselves with. We used it to construct beautiful hanging gardens. And that is just a matter of difference in real core sensibilities and beliefs.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like my background before Rails and Ruby was doing Python and Django, and I got hired to work on some Rails apps for a professor of mine when I was in college, and it took me a while to like understand the philosophy because in Python everything's like there should be one good way of doing things and it keeps it simple and everything is explicitly imported. And then I come to Ruby and Rails and I'm like, everything feels more readable. And I have no idea where some of this stuff is coming from. But like over time, I read the metaprogramming Ruby book and stuff. And it was kind of like pointing out to me that like the philosophy here is like you should be as best you can just absorbed in whatever context you're working in, you know. And so that like extending the language and having no idea the separation between, you know, is this feature built into Ruby or is it in active support? When you're coding, you don't really care as long as, you know, you don't have things conflicting with each other. It doesn't really matter, and it helps you stay focused on whatever you're doing, and it reads more like we would speak. And I always thought that was a cool thing. And I've always wondered, why do other languages not support like question marks at the end of the method name or an exclamation mark? Those are some of the like my most favorite features of Ruby that I wish every other language would adopt, you know? And it's just like it appeals to me for that same reason of like, I think that Ruby kind of thinks of programming as a way to communicate with other programmers or yourself 6 months from now versus like appealing to the compiler because it isn't smart enough to understand things. And that makes it like a really nice language to work with.
Absolutely. And it's also one of those reasons, of course, that Ruby itself is, I haven't actually looked at it in the C code, but I'm told heinously complex. Like the implementation of Ruby, even describing the Ruby language in a standard is very difficult. And there are plenty of people who've done heroic work, like the JRuby crew, on trying to boil it down. Like, what is actually Ruby? Can we come up with a formal notation for it? And I have all the sympathy with that, but I also regard that as the great triumph of what Mats did with Ruby. He basically said, I will bend over backwards on my end, making Ruby, and I don't care if it's really complicated. I want the appearance of using the language to be this fluid, poetic dance with a computer. And that may, the final program that we write in Ruby may look incredibly simple and easy on our eyes, and it may be heinously complex to parse and compile on the back end. That's exactly how it should be. And I find that a lot of programming environments, particularly those prior to Ruby that were popular, had the inverse perspective, that the programmer simply needed to be as explicit as possible and as verbose in some ways as possible, such to disambiguate any potential conflict, such that it was easier to write a fast, performant compiler. And I have no interest in that worldview. Like, that's not why I'm here. And I think that that's one of those fundamental philosophical ways of looking at the world, orienting yourself at the world, that then filters into 1,000 tiny decisions that then all add up to a real difference. And that's why when someone say, for example, that Python and Ruby, I mean, they're kind of the same, just different syntax. I just go like, no, I mean, they're not, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean there's better or not or worse. I mean, clearly for me, Ruby is better for me. And I make no bones about that because it appeals to my worldview and my sense of aesthetics and justice and all these other factors. But it also explains why we shouldn't try to boil this down to, oh, there should just be one language. we need as much diversity in programming language as there is diversity in people and sensibilities and orientations, and that is not a flaw. Which is also why the whole popularity contest, which I mean, I'll be honest, I mean, Ruby on Rails did play that for a while, and then I guess came to a point, or I came to a point where I was just like, why does it really matter? Like, as soon as you get a self-sustaining community, you're good. Like, you don't need to be the biggest thing out there. In fact, I think much of the constant churn and kind of constantly different approaches and very different views on things that are happening in JavaScript is happening because you're trying to force a bunch of people who have fundamentally different views of how programming should be done in under the same roof. And I think doesn't always work out so well. And I'm just more comfortable and more content in a community like Ruby, where we don't all agree on all the things, but we agree on a lot of the major things most of the time. And that enables us to do better work together.
We had Luca, who created the Hanami framework in Ruby, on the show a while back. And one thing he said was like, we're not trying to like unseat Rails. Like, it's not kind of like it's not a popularity contest. It's just an alternative. And I thought like that's such a great view of things, because I feel like when that, like, if it's winner take all, it's a lot of unnecessary conflict and stress that like I don't need. So
agreed. I mean, the irony, of course, is somewhat that the Ruby language is unique in the sense that, at least as far as web development goes, Rails has sort of broader influence on that language than almost any other frameworks has had on any other previous language, certainly in the web development world. But even so, the principle holds the same, that as long as you can find a community of people to work with. I mean, you look again at the Rails community, right? Like, the majority of the work is done by a relatively small group of people. At least if you look at sort of how much have each individual contributor contributed, there's a small handful of people who've contributed a lot, and then there's a very large community of people who've contributed a little. And both of those things matter. But if you had a much smaller community, you could still make a lot of headway, as we did with Ruby on Rails in the early days, where it was a tiny community. We still had everything that we needed to make things happen. And I think that that's part of the illusion that's good to knock down, is that, well, just because there are these frameworks like Rails itself that has had, 6,000 people contribute to the source code, and many thousands more contribute to the community at large. It looks like this huge behemoth, and like, if you were to start from scratch tomorrow, how could you possibly build something up like that? Well, nothing large ever was birthed large in the program community. Almost everything started from small beginnings. Certainly, if it's an open source piece of software that didn't have a huge corporation behind it pushing it. So that's one of the, like, okay, if there wasn't Rails, and like, I would just start building something else that would serve that for me, and I would start out just by building it by me alone, and then I'd invite a few people who might want to have a look and share some of the work, and then we do that. So I think part of it, though, is that it's not really about sort of the work. People are less, in my opinion, evaluating communities and frameworks on the basis of, oh, there needs to be a bunch of people because there's a bunch of work. No, they're looking for safety and security in numbers, and to be part of something that they feel like is successful, and thereby they are, as an extension of that, successful, which is a little sad from my perspective, but also human, I suppose. I recently read a wonderful book called Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm, who goes over this principle of how, if you feel partly powerless in your work or in your life, you can feel powerful by being part of a powerful movement or submitting to a powerful identity of some other kind. And I think some of that is what's going on in the program communities as well, as it is in all other factors of life. So
on a related note to that, we see kind of programmers by default these days looking for, if you're going to build a new app, you choose first your framework and then your backend framework, your front-end framework, and so on. But the thing I see consistently, time and time again from you guys, is that you think about things from first principles and you tend to build stuff from scratch. So, TurboLinks was kind of like we understand the premise of like React and what they're trying to get at with that, but what if we thought about it from scratch and, came up with that approach and Stimulus and Rails itself? And I'd love to hear kind of your philosophy on that and how you guys approach that and the trade-offs, I guess, because in some sense, I'm sure people think about choosing a framework as a option for speed. Like you don't have to go reinvent the wheel, but that may not necessarily be the best solution. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on like building new frameworks or like tools to do your job better.
Sure. So I think for me, it starts with the concept. Is the concept I'm trying to express, has that already been done? And when it comes to, for example, TurboLinks and everything that we're doing, the concept boils down to where do you want your HTML to be made? And I want to make my HTML on the server with Ruby because, first of all, I find that to be the most expressive place to make it. I have access to my entire domain model. I don't have to treat the whole system like a distributed system. I can send HTML down the wire, and that works well. And then if you accept that premise that making HTML on the server is a good thing, that you don't want to basically have a transport layer where you have to boil everything down to a bunch of JSON that you send over to JavaScript, and then you instantiate that on the JavaScript side, and then you have a lot of objects on the JavaScript side to deal with it, then a surprising number of consequences follow from that concept. And that's basically what we've been fleshing out, both with TurboLinks, with Stimulus, and we have a whole host of other ideas that we're building from that principle, that HTML is better cooked on the server and served to a client. Now, you could, of course, say, well, just don't do it like that. Just do it like what's currently in vogue in the industry, which is to just send JSON back and forth and then make more of your system on the client side in JavaScript. It totally works for some people to do that. First of all, I clearly have a bias towards writing things in Ruby. I also find that having worked with some of the data-driven approaches to front-end development, that they didn't feel very productive to me. Like I felt like I was a lot slower at making systems than what I was when I basically, and again, this is what I love these sayings where proponents on either side of the question can rally around it. Like I love to program like it's 2005, and for naysayers of that, they'll go like, well, you're just stuck in the past and you need to move to the present or whatever. That's not how we do things anymore. It's not modern. It's all these other things, right? And I look at 2005, which is basically a synonym for pre-heavy Ajax or just beyond sprinkles, and go like the amount of ground we could cover with tiny teams at that time was huge. Why would you want to get away from that? So the basic premise here is that keeping things simple in that regard, and yet still reaping the benefits of progress, reading the benefits of progress in terms of speed, which is certainly something users care about, certainly something I care about, but also seeing the diminishing returns. If you can simply respond to an action in 100 milliseconds, that's good enough. Like, yeah, maybe there's a way to respond in 20 milliseconds, but for most information systems, that additional latency just doesn't matter. So you're optimizing something that no users care about. I don't care about it as a user myself. I'd rather spend that on something else, like on a more productive, pleasurable development experience. So that is a lot of it. Is that I like to look at all these problems from that core concept. Is there a deeper assumption here that we can challenge? And the assumption behind React and other Ember and so forth is that rendering on the client side is a better way of creating quote unquote modern web applications. And I went like, do I actually believe that that's true? And we did a bunch of experiments when we were evaluating things at the second rewrite of Basecamp, and also actually at the third, where we looked at different ways of doing this, and would it really be a lot better? Could we make a better Basecamp, for example, if we moved everything to, say, React? And the answer was simply conclusively no. The changes that we could make in how the application felt would not be appreciable by users, and it wouldn't be something that would give us a material different standing in the marketplace, and it would make me, as a programmer, much more miserable. So that seemed like a poor trade. And therefore, we went searching for basically ways to do things that fit with our worldview and our perspective on how best to make applications, which, as I said, in this case, derived directly from the idea of sending HTML over the wire instead of sending JSON over the wire, and just following that to the end of the world in terms of consequences, which is quite similar to how Rails got going, is that, okay, I want to use Ruby to make a web application. What do I need? Oh, I need to talk to a database. I should probably wrap that in some objects. Oh, I need different adapters. I want to run SQLite on development or MySQL on production, or I want to collaborate with people on who use Postgres. We need this thing. Doesn't right? You start from these core assumptions here. Like, I want to use Ruby. Oh, there isn't something in Ruby right now to do all these things, so I got to make them myself. Okay, no biggie. I want to send HTML over the wire. Oh, there isn't a lot of tooling around that. No biggie. Let's just make it ourselves. I think sometimes programming can seem so complex because there's so many choices and they're so well developed and they're snazzy and they have websites and they have core teams and they have all these things. And that intimidates people to the point where they think they can't make things from first principles themselves. And I don't believe that. I've started, 40, 50 different gems, and most of them don't turn out to be Rails or even Active Record or something. There are just small things. And I just start with the smallest thing that could possibly work, essentially. And then I'll commit it and I'll share it. And a bunch of people will point out how it's inefficient or could be improved in some way, and they'll make improvements. And 15 years later, we end up with something like Rails. Or we don't, but either way, it both starts from this same origin that you don't have to be this genius to be able to consider things from first principles. In fact, much of my early code is like kind of not necessarily that great and gets rewritten all the time. I venture to say that the percentage of lines in the Rails code base that still has my avatar on the Git blame line, it's probably fairly low, even though it started out obviously in 2004. Like the count was 100% before anyone else contributed to it. So anyway, just a way of saying I don't have any fear of starting from scratch, of throwing all of it out and figuring what do we need to do here to fulfill the core assumptions and principles that I want to see work. And that's a way of where I fall in love with ideas. I fall in love with concepts, and then just get started and you make them happen. And it's easier than you would think it is, I think. Like, as I said in the beginning of this show, Ruby and Rails and Basecamp all came together at the same time for me. I started working on Basecamp using Ruby to do it. I was not a great Ruby programmer. I had just learned Ruby, in fact. And then I started building little pieces of tooling that I needed to build Basecamp, and they were not great pieces of tooling, but they got rolling, and just kept working at it. And then in the end, I had something to share that other people could improve upon. And hey, there you go. Just started from basically just a programming language, no or very little particular tooling for building web applications in it, and you took someone who was barely thought of himself as a programmer a few years earlier, and here we are, still running Basecamp to business 15 years later, and Ruby on Rails still going strong too.
That's funny because thinking about like, there's a lot of people that you see in the community who will be like, they ask questions like, where do I put this code? Like my business logic or whatever. And I think people, when they use frameworks and stuff, tend to have this like, we have to play within like the rules that Rails says, and we can like, our code can only go in the views folder, the controllers, the models, or the helpers. And like, they forget that like, this is all code that your app runs. Like, you should treat it as if all of that code was something you could modify. This is your code. And there's just this like different mentality now, I feel like, that a lot of programmers are just kind of looking for someone to tell them where to put stuff. And I don't know that a whole lot of them start a project like completely from scratch. Like, what if you had just Ruby on its own, no framework, and you were left to go build your web server? That there's not a lot of projects that start from complete scratch like that, or developers just don't do that anymore or something.
Which I think in many ways is not a bad thing, right? Like, the reason I got involved with Ruby was because Matt and a bunch of other people had done the core work in C, such that I didn't have to deal with that. And I was very happy to build on top of that work. So it's not necessarily that you have to start from scratch every time when that kind of doesn't matter. But I do think your first point is incredibly important, which is like, this is all just code. Like, if you arrive at a situation where you feel like, this is not right, you can open up the code and you can change it. And in no environment, I would say, is that as easy to do as in Ruby on Rails. Like, you can literally open up any gem, make a change right there in the editor to that gem you just opened, reload, and see your change. I mean, you may want to package up that change as an upstream patch or blah, 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 whatever later. But to understand how things work, we give you such a transparency into the system. And part of that, of course, is also that the conventions are there just because that's what most people do most of the time. It doesn't mean that it's what all the people have to do all of the time. And sometimes it does make sense to break out of those and just do something different. And that's one of those things, for example, where they're like, where should I put my business logic? Well, I just put another Ruby object in, or Ruby class in the models directory. It's not an active record. It's not something else. Like, that's totally fine. And I think part of that, though, is just the getting both familiar and comfortable and confident in programming itself is something that takes time. And the earlier you are in your evolution of that, or in your training for that, the more likely you are to think, well, someone probably thought about this and thought better. And the answer is sometimes, yep, that's true. Sometimes it's also not true. Like, someone didn't think about this at all, or didn't encounter this edge case or this use case. So you're the first person who really has to think about this. And sometimes telling the difference between those two can be a little difficult, but it's worth trying, because I think it's also how you actually learn and grow as a developer. When I was starting with Ruby, one of the greatest gifts was the fact that I could just open up the standard library and read a bunch of Ruby code. And I didn't understand all of it, and I didn't have to, but it gave me some bearings and some sense of where to go and a bunch of ideas. And, oh, you can do that? Wow, that's really cool. And I don't know if enough people do that. To me, one of my favorite commands in our whole ecosystem is bundle open. It'll literally open the gem that you're curious about right there in your editor, and you'll see the entire structure and layout of the source code, and you can make changes to it and reload your application and see those changes. Like, that's just an amazing way of learning anything. I do it all the time. I even do it on Rails code sometimes, where I'm like, oh, actually, I wonder how this works. Bundle open active record, search for this thing, look up the method. That's weird. I wonder what happens if I change this. I'll just change the code right there and reload and see what happens. And then like, oh, okay, like that does what I needed to do. Let me bundle that up as a patch and get it in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that for debugging like all the time. Like if it's a gem or if it's Rails or whatever, if it's code that, that I'm using that broke, probably I passed in something wrong. But if I just open up the code, and see where it crashed, then I know exactly like, oh, I, misunderstood and passed this wrong thing in here.
Yes.
And it just makes, there was a point where I didn't do that. And I see a lot of people on forums and stuff, struggling like, my code broke, help, I don't know what to do. And I'm always surprised by like, there's not this intuition to just open up that code and see it's in the stack trace. It tells you what line number, which file, even inside the gem.
Yes.
So just go read it, and if not, put a bybug in there. Like if you don't understand it, just, binding.pry or bybug or something, or print statements, and you'll be surprised how quickly you can learn Rails or Devise or any gem that you're using. It is like, one of those eye-opening moments. I think if you've never done it before, you're like, wow, I have all this power now. And it was always at your fingertips. You just didn't realize it.
And it's not even just a beginner thing. I still do all those things. I still put in tons of put statements to print stuff out. I start the debugger all the time. And as I said, I bundle open all the time. So once you get into this habit of this is how you learn how things work, then you'll continue to use that habit for the rest of your career. So the sooner you can get started, the better.
Before we let you go, I have one more question. So you said like you've been doing this 20 years, Rails, Ruby, they've matured. Of course, it's not as maybe present as it was a couple of years ago, but people talk about the demise of Ruby, and Ruby is dead and Rails is dead, and every year an article is written. And I'm just curious your perspective and your thoughts on that, and how like someone like me who like worries about that can kind of view the world moving forward.
I think a good place to start is ask yourself, why would you worry about what other people use? Why does that matter? For me, Ruby was good enough when virtually no one used Ruby, and Rails was good enough when only I used Rails. So right now we're in a situation where literally hundreds of thousands of times more users are using it. So does it really matter whether it's 100,000 users or 10,000 users or 5,000 users? Why do we seek refuge in popularity? Why does that matter? For me, clearly it doesn't. That's one of the reasons I picked Ruby in the first place and wrote Rails in it. But it doesn't have to be as extreme as that. I can understand why someone would want to go, I don't want to be alone in this world, in my community. But is that a realistic thing? I mean, I talked about Java being dead as kind of like a rhetorical poke back in like 2004. Is Java dead? No. Tons of people writing Java. Like things don't die, right? Once they reach a certain level of escape velocity, they just generally don't die. And what dies is people who are wrapped up in the sense of popularity contest of whether something is the most popular or the most recent. Like it can become unattractive for those people, and I think that's fair. And things have life cycles. Like it would be extremely odd, even bizarre, if something like Ruby on Rails, after, damn near 20 years, was still the most popular thing out there. Like, how would that even be possible? It wouldn't, right? So that's part of the aging process, is to realize that everything has a life cycle. And once you reach the life cycle of escape velocity, as Ruby on Rails has, clearly as Java has, as lots of other environments have, it's fine. Like, don't stress out. It reminds me of someone who's in their 40s and they're constantly thinking and talking about their 20s. Like, you're living in the past. And for what? You're trying to hold on to something that was. Trying to hold on to the fact that Ruby and Rails was the hottest thing ever in like 2007 or 8 or 9 or whatever you pick as your year, strikes me as someone in their 40s trying to look back in their 20s and wishing that they were there. I'm almost 40 now, turning 40 in like 2 months. Do I wish I was 20? Fuck no. Like, I don't want to go back. I'm happy living life forward, whether that is in my technology choices or it's in my personal life. Is that like I experienced things, they were good, and then I move forward. So I'd say giving up on this anxiety around popularity is a truly liberating place to be. I've been reading a lot of Eric Fromm books lately. Another great book on that topic is To Have or To Be. And I'd invite your listeners, if they have those similar anxieties, to dive into that book. It really describes very well of how a lot of modern anxieties are tied up in having, and having sort of a place in the most popular development environment or whatever, rather than being a person who make authentic choices for themselves based on core principles and concepts. Obviously, I think the latter is the place to be. And for me, it's funny. I mean, I look at a lot of other programming languages just to fish for ideas, but and I won't rule out that one day someone is going to come up with something that just blows Ruby out of the water. But in the same sense, I'm not constantly shopping around. I'm not constantly jogging for like, oh, what's the new next hot thing that I can jump to? And not because whether or not it's hot or not hot, but as in a sense of just like, is that something that appeals to the core concepts that I'm working with? Are they improving those in material ways where I want to step out, or what's going on? And what I've found, again, clearly I'm biased and clearly I'm more invested in this ecosystem and language than most other people. So I'll accept those charges. But a lot of what I see is some good ideas and a bunch of regressions. And then I try to see, hey, could we just be inspired by the good ideas and avoid the regressions? Great. Then that's a step forward.
Yeah, it feels similar to describing, TurboLinks versus a single page framework. It's like, hey, there's some good ideas here, but if we just take this one nugget of intercepting links and not having to refresh CSS and JavaScript, we get all this benefit, and we don't have to rewrite everything for the front end, and that's pretty neat.
And I think, and the great example about that is TurboLinks in the grand scheme has not been a success in the popular sense of what like Ruby on Rails have been a success in terms of like number of developers using this technique. TurboLinks has relatively low adoption, but TurboLinks has been an extreme success for us at Basecamp. It's allowed us to do things and even construct our company in ways that I think would be very difficult to do so without. Partly this is around how the TurboLinks story plays in with mobile, how it enables us to write hybrid applications with tiny mobile teams that allow us to keep the entire company pretty small, even though we have a presence on all the major mobile platforms. So in that sense, TurboLinks is just a roaring success. And you know what? Like, I have a sort of passing curiosity and interest in letting others in on that success. But ultimately, like, it doesn't really matter. It's not like I'm not going to use TurboLinks as a concept. This idea of sending HTML over the wire, whether someone else uses it or not, like in the assessment of whether I should use it or not, like, I don't really give two flying fucks as to whether someone else does. Like, that doesn't that's this idea of going to the core principles and core consideration. Like, hey, this is what we want to do. If someone else want to come on board, awesome, fine, come on board. If you don't want to come on board, awesome, fine, don't come on board, right? So I think that TurboLinks is really the best example, actually, to explain that better so than Ruby on Rails, because Ruby on Rails has been this huge success, right? And TurboLinks just hasn't gotten the same traction. And it totally doesn't matter. And we continue to double down on it. In terms of amount of programming hours being invested in core framework development at Basecamp, more hours are going into building TurboLink, Stimulus, and auxiliary frameworks around that than most of the time that goes into building Rails. And that's fine with me.
Do you think that like people worry about popularity because your perspective is like you're an entrepreneur, you get to choose and use whatever you want, whereas someone who's an employee has to worry about finding a company using the tools that they want to work with, like Rails or, whatever. Do you think that's one of the reasons why people worry about popularity of Rails and stuff like that?
Yeah, I could definitely see that, but that to me reflects a very low self-esteem that I think someone should examine in themselves. If you become really good at writing Ruby on Rails because you care about learning how to program and you want to improve, those skills are not that isolated. Like if you were forced to work with something that you wouldn't prefer to work with, but you had to work with, you could probably switch over pretty easy, right? Like if you look at the main influx of Java people in the early 2000s, a very large percentage of those were small talk programmers who ended up for a variety of commercial reasons to give up on small talk and just accept that Java was the commercial alternative. Did that make them poor Java programmers? Of course it didn't. Like some of the most influential thinkers in that world were people who came from small talk. So I think that this anxiety about like, oh, am I learning the wrong thing is a very myopic way of looking at learning and as improvement as programmers. And also just flat out premature, especially when it comes to something like Ruby on Rails. There's been millions of Ruby on Rails applications created. If you like working on Ruby on Rails and you care and tend to your craft in such a way that you become a good programmer, you will have work in the Ruby on Rails community for decades to come.
That's really good. I appreciate that. I'm going to cancel my therapy session for later. No, that's a really good way to look at it because it is like hearing it like that, like it does seem a little silly now. So I
understand those anxieties, right? And I don't want to be glib to them because it can come across glib, especially as you say, not only am I an entrepreneur, I don't have, I was going to say earthly worries. That sounds even more self-indulgent, but in the sense of like, I don't need to worry about finding another job, right? Through my circumstances. But I also, I had to worry about those things when I started on Ruby on Rails. So for me personally, that's not a thing, but I understand those worries, especially if you're in a country like the US, which is just such an incredibly brutal and unforgiving society where you lose your job and all of a sudden the domino effect of that might mean you lose your health insurance and it might mean this, that, and the other thing that truly are life-threatening consequences. I can very much sympathize with people being afraid of that. Of course, that fear has a tendency to manifest itself in all sorts of irrational ways that aren't truly thought through. And I think that's worth examining. Not sort of feel guilty about having the fear in the first place. I think actually the fear is a rational response to an incredibly unjust and brutal society. But that's another hour for another podcast.
Yeah, and when you talk about like skills are transferable, like there is solace to be found in that.
For sure. And that's where it's funny, I'm taking both sides of this argument. First, we're saying like, well, Python and Ruby, for example, like they're actually quite different. They are in their sensibilities and what they focus on, but like the core aspects of becoming a good programmer and writing good code, there's obviously a ton of overlap in that. And I'd say for most programming languages, there is a large amount of overlap. Yes, there are some large paradigms like functional programming versus object-oriented programming that has some sort of splits between them, but I think that's the minor of the 2 points. And either way, it's not like we're facing a clash of civilizations here in the sense of a clash of clash of programming paradigms that if you did object-oriented programming, you're forever left behind because like the future now is entirely functional programming. That's just not a thing outside the head of a few Hacker News commenters.
So to kind of wrapping up, you have a book that came out last year, and then Shape Up do you consider that's a book? It's online for free. Is there anything else that you have going on that worth mentioning here you want to share?
I think Shape Up is a great one to plug. We just released that. Ryan Singer compiled the book based on how we work at Basecamp. We've been sharing a lot of business, hiring, marketing, broad ideas about how we work for a long time. Rework was a big bestseller of that. The latest book we have, It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, just from last year, touches on that. But Shape Up goes into the nitty gritty of how we actually work week to week and how we structure the work and how we, as is in the title, shape up the work and present the work. And I think that's a debate that kind of went dormant for a long time after Agile saw and conquered all. I was around for the early days of that, where Agile was sort of fighting either a real or perceived battle against waterfall and other heavy-duty methodologies. So I think a lot of times people have kind of just not questioned the methodologies of work for a while. They've just accepted that Agile as a big bucket is a thing, or Scrum in its particulars is a thing, and that's just what we do, and backlogs are just a fact of nature, and that's something we can't question. We question all those things in Shape Up, and we question them from a perspective of actually having done something else and sharing what we do instead. And I think that's a great book, especially for developers to dive into and start questioning how they work. Yeah. So I think that's well, let me plug one more thing too, because I'm always getting heckled about not plugging enough, which is our Rework podcast, because we're actually taking a lot of the concepts from Shape Up and we're turning those into episodes. There already was one episode on Shape Up itself, and we're going to do some more deep dives on that. I have a burning desire to do an episode on bugs are not special, which was a debate I just had over the last few days on Twitter and elsewhere. So that's going to appear on the Rework podcast. That's rework.fm. And I go on there a fair bit since we produce it in-house at Basecamp. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. I love your podcast, and I haven't had a chance to read the entire thing yet of Shape Up, but I'm really looking forward to doing that, hopefully this weekend. Jason, you have anything else you want to mention?
Last thing that just came to my mind. So I know Rails 6 RC2 went out recently, or is going out.
Is out. Yep.
Is out. Okay. How is that shaping up for the official 6.0 release?
Good. Too slowly, in my opinion. We've been sitting on the 6.0 release for too long. And part of that is I had other things distracting me for a while, so I wasn't pushing on it. And I think just summer break in general and so on. But Rails 6 is essentially done and has been done for a long time. We've been kind of fiddling with it a bit and should just have pushed it out. And this is now the last stop before the push. I'm hoping that maybe as soon as next week or the week after that, we can push out final.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for all your work on Rails and just Ruby and the community in general. We also really appreciate you joining us today.
Absolutely.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Chris, you got anything else?
I don't think so. Yeah, thanks again for joining us. We were really excited to hear you were going to be on the show. So, yeah. Well, maybe have you on again in the future.
Absolutely.